What exactly is nonverbal communication? Well, nonverbal communication is all aspects of communication except for the words themselves. And you might have heard the statistics somewhere between 70 to 93% of all communication between people is nonverbal. It's important then to understand the differences between what verbal and nonverbal means, because sometimes when we think about verbal, necessarily think about the nonverbal aspects of that. So there's really two kinds of things. There's verbal and nonverbal, and then there's vocal and nonvocal. Vocal communication are spoken words. Verbal communication that's nonvocal would be written words. Text messages, your social media posts, handwritten letters, etc. Those are still considered verbal communication. They're not considered nonverbal. Nonverbal vocal communication would be your tone of voice, size, screams, vocal qualities like loudness, pitch, etc. And the nonverbal nonvocal communication would be gestures, movement, appearance, facial expression, and we'll talk about a lot more. I also want to point out that sometimes people will say that it could be in deaf culture, ASL or signing is nonverbal, and that's not true because signing is words. It's literally words. So signing would be considered verbal communication, and nonverbal is everything that's not words. So if you're signing, but you're putting facial expressions to that, that would be the nonverbal aspect. But the actual signs themselves are considered verbal. So just to clarify that. Nonverbal communication is impossible to avoid. We have nonverbal communication all throughout our communication experiences. Nonverbal communication is part of our identity management. So how do we construct our face? How do we set our appearance? What's our posture? How much gesturing do we do? Our nonverbal communication can help us define our relationships. When you think about just observing people out in public, it's usually easy to tell whether or not someone is in a relationship or if they're friends or if they're total strangers by observing how closely they sit together, the facial expressions and the openness of their body toward one another. If I'm sitting next to someone like this, you can probably assume the person sitting next to me isn't a friend or someone I'm wanting to communicate with. Now, it's ambiguous in that maybe I'm like this because the person next to me just ticked me off. They're my best friend and I'm really mad right now. So it's ambiguous in that sense. But for the most part, we can draw some pretty stable conclusions about people's relationships. If you see someone holding hands, wearing wedding rings, tipping their heads together, making eye contact, smiling at each other, it's pretty safe to assume they're not strangers. Again, it could be ambiguous. We can't always read nonverbals correctly because people have their own unique idiosyncrasies about nonverbal communication, and we have our own ways of interpreting things based on our experiences. But at the same time, we define our relationships by how we stand next to someone, look at them, talk to them, how open or closed we are towards them. Being able to competently and correctly use nonverbal communication in the right settings is essential to your success. I think about some examples like on SNL, Will Ferrell plays this character who can't control the volume of his voice, and it's very hilarious, but also goes to show how unprofessional something can be if you are not able to control how loud you are. There's lots of examples of people being inappropriate because their nonverbals don't fit the scenario or the situation. Nonverbal communication has a lot of different functions. The first is to accent what we're saying, and you can hear this in the way that my tone of voice and the inflection of my voice varies as I'm talking about something. When I really mean something important, I accent it with my voice, and you can hear me doing that. I could also, accent it, say, this is really important. You need to remember this. And I can use hand gestures and movements. I can raise my eyebrows. I can tilt my head. All of those things accent my message, and they make my message more important than speaking in a very flat monotone without making any changes whatsoever. Nonverbal communication can help you repeat something. Someone asks, where's the trash can? Oh, it's over there. So I said the words, it's over there, but then I pointed, and that was repeating my message. It was adding to it. We can use nonverbal communication to substitute, and when we do that, it's called emblems. An emblem is something that has a direct verbal translation. For instance, you're probably very familiar with using the middle finger to tell someone that you're angry about something or upset, or perhaps you use it jokingly. I don't know. We have to be very careful about emblems sometimes because they don't cross cultural boundaries. For instance, the okay gesture that we might use. So if someone says, how was your meal? You're chewing. It was great, is what you mean. If you were to do that in Italy or Brazil, various places, you'd be calling someone an a-hole. So wouldn't do that. But emblems are actually substituting in place of verbal words, and we understand what they mean. So the reason this is different than what I was talking about earlier with ASL is there's not really anything inherently tied to like waving at someone or doing this that means those particular words. They're just things that we've culturally created to mean that. We can complement our message by providing illustrators. For instance, if someone says, how big is that phone? Well, it's about that big, right? So I'm illustrating it. How tall was that guy? About this tall. One of my favorite things to do or say is when someone says, I've had it up to here with you, but when I stand up, it's not that bad. All right, illustrating. Another function of nonverbal communication is to regulate. And regulating is one of my all-time favorite functions of nonverbal communication because we do it in such subtle ways that we don't often realize we're doing it. Regulating nonverbal communication is when you're having a conversation with someone and you want them to stop talking. You're done with the conversation. You need to perhaps leave. There's a lot of different regulating things you can do nonverbally. You can reduce the amount of talking that you've done. Obviously, you don't want to continue contributing to the conversation. So you might give some vocalizations that indicate that you're done with the conversation. You might say, oh, and not really express any more words or conversation to keep it going. You might decrease your eye contact and start looking away as if you're less interested in the conversation, just very casually making eye contact with someone and then looking away. You might glance at your watch. You might start collecting your things and putting your coat on. That would be regulating. You might even start taking a step back or angling your shoulders towards the door to indicate that. When you're on the phone with someone and you're ready to get off the phone, you might start doing more of those vocalizations as well, or having a higher pitch at the end of your voice to indicate, okay, well, that sounds really good. So it is the words you're saying, but it's also the way that you're saying it. So you're regulating the conversation. Alternatively, if you want the conversation to keep going, you might lean into someone, can keep making eye contact, nodding at them, smiling, encouraging them to talk, laughing at what they're saying, etc. So you can regulate the conversation. Nonverbal communication can also contradict our message. If I tell you, no, I'm not mad, do you believe me? Or if I say, no, I'm not mad, then you might say, oh, she's not mad. But if I cross my arms and I look away and I give you one of these, no, I'm not upset. My nonverbals are contradicting my verbals. And then finally, that takes us to deceiving, which is intentionally trying to hide something. Now, we all think that we're pretty good at understanding when someone's being deceptive, but in truth, it's really difficult to read people's nonverbal communication because they are so unique to us, and we all have our own filters and ways of understanding. If you've ever seen the show Lie to Me, the premise, I guess, is that this man is a human lie detector, and his work is actually based on the work of real psychologist and communication expert Paul Ekman, who invented the term micro-expressions, which are these little millisecond expressions that we make that give away our true feelings about something. Nose wrinkling or the upper lip raised might show disgust. And these are sort of universal reactions that we have that we don't always are not able to control, that give away our true feelings about something. When you feel angry about something, knitting your eyebrows together, you're surprised, someone jumps out and says, boo. You can't necessarily control your face, but it's probably going to be one of surprise. Contempt, like when we're just, someone's absolutely disgusting to us. Fear, being surprised, our eyes get bigger. Sadness and that sort of thing. So he has a whole list of various micro expressions. And like I said, Lie to Me is the fictional account of this researcher, but you should look up the work of Paul Ekman and his partner Friesen, where they invented this concept of microexpressions. There's some really neat videos on how they managed to find these and how they can train people to become actual lie detectors. And it's not as easy as you think it is.